American. And as for an American, it is one of the lead issues in the world. Israel is able to do these things, to dismantle and destroy the West Bank, to disintegrate the community, because the United States gives it massive aid, unparalleled in international affairs, not only military and economic, but also diplomatic, by, as I mentioned, for the last 30 years, unilaterally blocking the two-state settlement, which Israel also totally rejected, alone, the two of them. And as long as you, the American taxpayer, goes on supporting this, yes, it'll continue. And it'll lead to exactly what the Bantustan-style solution that Ben Veniste and others described, right on the ground. And yes, so therefore it's of enormous importance to Americans. As for solutions, pretty straightforward. They were coming close to a solution at Taba until Israel called it off. Negotiations continued, leading to several proposals, of which the most detailed were the Geneva Accords. You can find out what I thought about all of those in print. You can ask Mr. Dershowitz where he supported them in print. The Geneva Accords in December 2002 were accepted by essentially the whole world. Israel rejected them. The U.S. refused even to send a message to the Geneva meetings. But they're still potentially alive, and American citizens can compel our own government to reverse its program, to accept the international consensus for the first time, and then we'll be on the way to a solution.
Yes, folks. Left Reckoning, once again, this is, I hasten to say, Matt Lech with David Griscom, and we are appreciating Chomsky. We are not remembering Chomsky today.
Yeah. No, I mean, really happy to, we've been planning this episode for a little while. Really happy to have Nathan Robinson on the program to talk about Chomsky, who I'm sure people sort of saw the kerfuffle online today. But Chomsky is very unwell, and we want to make sure that we were putting some stuff out there that was highlighting his legacy, because I think it's actually a very important thing to fight for and claim today. Because, Lord, I mean, you probably saw it today, Matt. A lot of freaks out there who are really looking forward to attacking this person's legacy. So
I actually didn't see people attacking him. Who was any of the
usual suspects? The Bellingcat freaks and all those guys have been laying in wait for that. The kind of general
some nerds, but yeah,
some big time nerds for sure. But anyways, I mean, we'll be talking with Nathan in just a little bit about Noam Chomsky and his legacy. It's really great to have Nathan on the program as well. But before we get there, I also wanted to note that later in the evening, we're going to be joined by a return guest on Left Reckoning, Moureen Kaki, who is in Gaza. And I really want to make sure that people stick around and watch that interview, because it's a really important thing. This is somebody who is in Gaza, has an on-the-ground perspective of what's going on there. It's very harrowing, very difficult conversation, but very honored to have her on this program. And you don't really get to have many conversations with folks in Gaza for obvious logistical reasons. So we're very, very proud and honored to be able to host that conversation here on Left Reckoning today.
Yeah, I know people remember we had Moureen on after October 7th, and I've thought many times of the way she said Biden doesn't appear to even see us as human, and how actually, unbearable that's played out. It's and some folks might have thought that was premature, and to say like that after October 7th, it wasn't. It was actually the exact right time to have said that. And it's been horrible, and a lot of respect to Moureen for the work she's doing.
100%. So yeah, we'll have that conversation just a little bit. Just want to remind folks, if you want to join us in the post game, you can get access to that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Become a Left Reckoner. Matt and I have some really fun stuff you're not going to want to miss in the post game, friends.
And Tomas Kennedy on the Sunday show last Sunday, going into not only DeSantis and his climate stuff, but also Biden's border stuff, including he predicted sort of the movement that Biden's done today. And I don't want to detail it because I don't have the details in, but you can look into Tomas Kennedy for both the horrible stuff with regards to asylum and these sort of citizenship measures Biden's put in place.
Yeah. Well, I know we've already sort of introduced it, Matt, but just want to re-up one more time. There was some misinformation out there today. Chomsky is alive. That was confirmed by his family. We had planned this episode out way before. It just sort of happened to coincide with whatever happened on Twitter today. But yeah, we have this really great conversation with Nathan Robinson about Noam Chomsky. So enjoy that, and then stick around for a conversation with Maureen. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Lech. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. And we're really excited to be joined by our guest today, Nathan Robinson. You know Nathan from the excellent Current Affairs magazine. And Nathan, frankly, it's been way too long. It's a shame it's taken us this long to get you on the program. We're really very happy you're here.
You never invited me up to that. How many episodes have you done? You never invited me.
Well, we'll rectify that now. I think we got a banger here. And this is a pretty broad subject, but an important one. And as folks know, the excellent teacher and comrade, Chomsky is unwell right now, pretty seriously so. And Matt and I want to do something to sort of talk about Chomsky and his legacy and influence on so many of us. And the first person whose name popped into my head was Nathan, because I know Chomsky has been a huge influence on you. So I really appreciate you coming on the program to talk about Chomsky. And maybe to just set us up, could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Chomsky, like, how you came across his work and how it affected you when you first came across it?
Yeah, so I think I was given when I was 14, 15, I had a friend in the high school who was a year above me and who gave me, fairly sure it was Failed States by Chomsky. It's the first I'd seen, and told me I had to read it, that it would, blow my mind and what have you. And I have to say my initial exposure to Chomsky was that I struggled to get through the book because I was not at that point very interested in foreign policy. And I couldn't really understand, I was interested in domestic economics and inequality, and I just didn't, all this stuff about Chile in 1973 did not interest me that much. And so I was a little put off, and I don't know that I made it through the book for a while. And then over the next years, through just exposure to his interviews, oftentimes it was his interviews that I found the most compelling. Just listening to him talk and how kind of sensible and careful and rational he was, how easily he kind of deflated bad ideas, the sharpness of his thinking. And what I came to appreciate and what was so influential on me was, as I say, not exactly the foreign policy analysis, although the book that I'm publishing with him in the fall is a summary of his foreign policy analysis. It was more like the Chomsky method, which was just so calm, so literate, so well researched, right? I mean, all his books are so dense with footnotes, but they're footnotes to reliable sources. You go and you look up anything Chomsky says and you know that he has a source for it. He was just such a careful political thinker and reasoner. And so when I started doing political writing, that really entered my style a lot. I wanted to be able, but he was also scathing, right? So Chomsky has this incredibly dry wit and this withering style. And I feel like anyone who reads my writing these days can probably see where the influence is.
Yeah, it's one thing that's funny about or interesting about Chomsky compared to just like a lot of other left-wing writers, let's say, is that Chomsky really is not afraid to use kind of, I don't know, like official government sources or like mainstream accounts of things, not in some kind of, you know, fidelity to, you know, that he believes everything that's in the New York Times, but it's somebody who is like actively like engaging with the world around them versus like a lot of folks on the left. I'll just be honest that, you know, you will see not just like an echo chamber, but just like a kind of refusal to interact with certain kinds of mainstream sources. And I think that's something that I think is really compelling for a lot of people who are interacting with Chomsky who aren't, let's say, like, you know, 2 feet in on the left wing side.
One of the things about his technique is that he insists that if you read the New York Times, you know, cover to cover, you can find a good part of the truth in there, but you just have to read it carefully. Like, so a lot of his, you know, really harsh critiques of Israeli policy are built out of things he's found in the Israeli newspapers, which he read very carefully. So oftentimes, you know, the governments admit what they're doing. And you just have to kind of look, and you have to know what to look for. And he's very good at selecting, you know, going through, and there are so many amazing admissions. And as I was doing this book with him that we just, well, it was finished a while ago, but it is being published now. There are so many incredible moments where, you know, the most damning evidence is found, you know, on page A15 of the New York Times.
He really is the ultimate facts don't care about your feelings guy. Like, he really, it's a very dispassionate sort of, I just finished The Fateful Triangle, and, you know, all of his books, and, you know, my experience was... It is. I got on Audible, so I listened to the audiobook. But you know, my experience was I bought the manufacturing consent because of the was it Good Will Hunting, where they talk about Chomsky and Howard Zinn, and like you, like, it was tough for me to get through. It was like, actually, like, communication studies, I should have been into it, but it was just very heady. And then I read Hopes and Prospects. But it's interesting, like, contrasted with Hitchens, who was sort of the other, like, towering figure of, I think, say, guys in their mid-30s, intellectual sort of speakers. Like, Chomsky was always the dispassionate facts guy, and whereas Hitchens was like the personality.
I was just watching a thing he did where he said, you should strive to be a bad speaker. Because if you're a good speaker, then you're, like, fooling people with, like, rhetoric, and you're trying to, and he's like, you shouldn't try to persuade people either. You should just, like, he really believes, like, you should just lay out the facts. You shouldn't have drama in your speeches. You shouldn't even really have, like, structure to them. Like, I remember when I was in college and Chomsky came to speak, and it's just like his speech started, and then 90 minutes later it ended. But I was like, well, and he told me a lot of things that I didn't know about, but was there a beginning, middle, and end? Not really. And actually, one of the contributions that I make to this book, The Myth of American Idealism, is that I wanted to kind of give Chomsky a little more structure, a little more of a, like, beginning, middle, and end, a little more of the thing that he is bit reluctant to do on his own, which is some rhetoric, a little bit of flair. So I think this book has a little bit of flair to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you wouldn't mind, talk a little bit about this book project, folks.
Well, so this is crazy because I mentioned, you know, when I read Chomsky a bit in high school, and then obviously he was a very formative influence on me intellectual, but I didn't know the guy, right? He was just a towering intellectual. He's the most cited intellectual in the Western world or whatever. And then when I started Current Affairs, so in 2015, we started Current Affairs with a crowdfunding campaign. In 2016, I wrote a book about Bill Clinton called Super Predator. And I knew a guy, John Halley, who was the son of one of Chomsky's longtime MIT collaborators. Morris Halley is famous linguistics professor there. And John got my book to Chomsky, and Chomsky really liked the book, and he subscribed to the magazine. So he's been one of our subscribers for years, since the very early days. And he would, and then he would, like, email us when his issue didn't show up. And this is crazy, and this is another thing that he's always done, is that he's been really supportive of small left ventures. He gives tons of blurbs to books with little lefty publishers. I was just talking to Doug Henwood, who publishes the Left Business Observer, and when he started that, Chomsky bought a subscription and paid by check, and so he subscribes to and supports a lot of small things. And so I had corresponded with him just a bit, and then I asked him if he'd be interviewed for the magazine, so I flew out to Tucson. I did an interview with him. That was in like 2018. I did another interview with him a few years later, and then at a certain point, I just got real bold, and I was like, hey, could we write something together? Because I knew that he is very open to collaborators. He's co-written a lot of stuff. Manufacturing Consent was co-written with Edward Herman. He's had tons of collaborators. So I thought, well, could we co-write something? So we co-wrote an article on the Afghanistan war for Current Affairs, and I can't remember if it was before or after the article that I asked him if we could just do a book. Because I've always wished there was like a one-stop shop, like, intro to Chomsky that was really good. There's one called Understanding Power that's great, but it's from the early 90s, so it doesn't have anything on the last 30 years. And so it's a little dated, and I just wanted there to be like a summary of the, of his critique. So I thought, well, I'm an editor. I'd be really good at like taking his words and helping sort of craft them in a way that was accessible. So this book, which sort of began with me taking everything he'd ever said and working with him to go like, okay, well, is this the important thing about this event that should be said? And is this the important thing about this event? And okay, let's rework it and update it. And it was really, really cool. It wasn't quite done at the time that he had his health event, so I was sort of left with this giant pile of notes that I had to kind of edit. Most of the book was complete. It was very close, but we still had this giant pile of notes. So I've had to kind of, polish it off. But now it's ready for print, and I think it respects what he would ultimately have wanted the exact finished product to be, because I did everything with that in mind.
Yeah, that consideration as somebody who produces a show, we had Chomsky on the old Michael Brooks show, and that was maybe a capstone of that period. And I always felt like maybe we should try to get him on Left Reckoning, but I also wanted to respect his time a little bit. But I do think because frankly, he was doing everybody reaching out to him, and I appreciate that a lot. And I just felt like there's a little bit of a feeding frenzy, but that to compile his work like that and sort of give people the overview, I think is a really valuable endeavor, because there's going to be a lot of young people who weren't in the mid 2000s seeing him as one of the few people who would be mentioned as a genuine left voice.
And he's never, one of the strange things about that I kind of just realized through working with him is he's very, very, very confident. Like he will savage you in a debate, right? If you start arguing, he will savage you. But he's also weirdly humble or modest. Like he disparages his own work in a certain sense. His significance. He's like, oh, it doesn't mean anything to me. And he would never have. The crazy thing is, he's never published. It's not that he's never published a book, because obviously he's published 100 books. But he just oftentimes the books aren't his idea. Like someone will come to him, just like this book, and say wow, you said these incredible things. Can we put them in a book? He had never, when I approached him about this, I said, we've got to do a book proposal to the publisher, right? And he's like, do we? He's like, I've never done a book proposal. He's like, so it never occurred to him to sit down and try to sell a book. That would almost be an act of arrogance to presume that you had so he's never sat down and go, I have my ideas, I'm going to put my great ideas together in a book. He just kind of says things off the cuff, and other people are like, that's really profound. And he's like, okay, well, if you think it's profound, you can have it. And he would also this democratic thing where he would go on any podcast. I mean, he really when Current Affairs was tiny, he came on our podcast. You see him on YouTube channels with 40 followers.
Mm. And the email is obviously very, very famous.
Right.
You know,
The
anyone
emails.
could write him an email.
The email archive. I swear, I just thought recently that he probably has close to the world record for most emails, like substantive emails, not spam emails, but like real emails ever sent. Because he started doing this in the very earliest days of email, and then he did it for hours and hours and hours a day, non-stop, until he was 95. So, he might have close to the world record for most emails ever sent.
Well, yeah, the meme of him getting anybody responding to any inquiry is like, that was like 2007. That was already out there.
I mean, while we're on the subject of emails, before we start playing some clips and talk a little bit more, about his like ideology and work, I have to say, I think one of my favorite, and I would love if y'all had something to share too after this, but like one of my favorite Chomsky, at least in recent years, Chomskyisms, is when he had this horrible, only horrible because of who he was arguing against, debate with Sam Harris via email. I don't know if y'all remember this.
Oh, yeah.
Sam Harris, who we can, everyone's been watching this since TMBS, Left Reckoning knows, Sam Harris is an extremely dangerous reactionary who loves to present himself as, like, in a lot of ways, he likes to present himself as what Chomsky actually is, like a very rational, principled, philosophical person. And Chomsky just destroyed him with, I think, the simplest line ever, which is that Sam Harris is a religious fanatic who worships the state, which completely upended that debate, because Sam Harris, that caused Sam Harris to have a complete breakdown, because just in just one line, Chomsky just eviscerated Sam Harris's whole political project.
They had a long email exchange. Sam Harris, by the way, I've written an article about Sam Harris, or co-written an article with Eli Massey called "Being Mr. Reasonable," and it's about exactly that, pretending to be reasonable when you're in fact a fanatic. And Sam Harris, his only response, by the way, you can check the Sam Harris Reddit forum where all of his fans were like, did he ever write a response to Robinson? And no, he didn't. What he did was he said, Nathan Robinson is mentally ill, and I know this because of the length at which he's talked about me. Now, I went to length so I could debunk all his arguments, but his response, he didn't. So a rational person would have replied to the arguments, but he didn't reply to the arguments. He replied with, what did he reply with? An ad hominem. Well, there's your rationality there, right? Just like, William Buckley ends up slipping into the ad hominems and threatening to punch you, if you get him. So anyway, the Chomsky-Sam Harris email exchange, though, was very interesting because, yes, he waved him away as a worshiper of the state, but the email exchange is about the question of collateral damage versus intentionality. Chomsky has often branded the U.S. as a terrorist state, and Harris is saying, well, how can we be when we mean well? Our victims are by accident, whereas when Osama bin Laden, is trying to kill people, but we just do it out of benevolence, but we wish we didn't have to. And Chomsky points out to him, rather, correctly, that this idea that if you don't kill intentionally, it's morally better, actually doesn't hold up. It sounds superficially persuasive, but Chomsky's like, if you start dropping bombs on a country and you say, I'm not trying to kill the people in it, they're just ants to me. Like, their lives don't mean anything. He's like, that can actually be worse than intentional killing. Because you might intentionally kill someone to accomplish a goal, like you assassinate someone who you believe is, you kill Hitler or whatever. An intentional killing might be done in a way that is more morally justified than a negligent killing. And this point, Sam Harris just could not. He's like, but we're better because we don't do it on purpose.
Yeah, kind of a relevant debate, I think, through the ages, it seems like. Here's a clip of Chomsky, answering a question that I think he's probably answered 10,000 times, about, like, if his approach is for it helps America's enemies, basically.
Are you kicking the U.S. when it's down?
No, I'm asking that we accept the definition of hypocrite given in the Gospels. I think that's correct. The hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. I don't think we should be hypocrites.
To what aim do you do this? To what aim do you wish to point this at?
Because I think we should try to rise to the level of minimal moral integrity. Once we can rise to the level of minimal moral integrity, then we can discuss these issues seriously. If we can't even rise to that level, there's any point just talking. Minimal moral integrity requires that if we think something is wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it.
Really a classic thing, and I just can't help but think about that when I saw somebody say, why can't the global south recognize that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is wrong when America is trying to get a global coalition to that? So, well, it's because we aren't sincere about a lot of these things, and we sort of invoke a principle that we don't help to live by ourselves, and that has been true since Chomsky was a young guy going on firing line.
Right. This is really at the core. I mean, this idea that we need to apply the same standards that we apply to others to ourselves, and that I open, in organizing the book, my thinking was, because I was in charge of the organizing, right? They're Chomsky's ideas, and my role is to figure out where to put them and in what order to try and get people to understand them. So I was he deferred to me completely on where do we put stuff. And so right up front, I put all the stuff about, let's evaluate if we think, it's wrong to interfere in foreign elections. Well, first we need to ask, do we do this? If we think that the Chinese spy balloon is an affront to us, well, do we examine what we do to China? Do we spy on China, right? If we think that it is aggression for a country to, say, I don't know, station missiles near our border, do we think it is aggression for us to station missiles closer and closer to China or closer and closer to Russia? Are we going to, if we think that Vladimir Putin belongs in The Hague, do we think that George W. Bush belongs in The Hague? And if we don't think this, why don't we think it? And this is such a central point to his analysis. It's interesting that guy, what's fascinating to me is how many people are surprised or mystified when Chomsky says very obvious things. So the guy was well, to what end do you point all this out? Why? And he's well, because, I don't know, maybe being basically morally decent and consistent, achieving a minimal standard of normal moral behavior, I think is important.
Yeah, as if you can only invoke morality towards some other end. It's wild that blows people's minds.
To what end?
But, I mean, I find this is an interesting thing about Chomsky, though. Even compared, so obviously with certain kinds of mainstream journals or whatever, to what end? But also with some people on the left, Chomsky gets accused by some very strange folks of being to use modern terms, a tanky, because he'll oppose American intervention. But he's very reviled actually by some people in those circles as being too much of because he doesn't support certain kind of dictators or certain moments in history. I'm curious how you would sort of describe, this legacy of his foreign policy, because it's not just a kind of campism or a knee-jerk anti-Americanism too, which I think is a very interesting and understated thing about Chomsky. This is
another thing that I tried to help him bring out in this book, and I don't think people are going to be as confused about this because a lot of the criticisms are things why don't you talk? Why do you talk so much about America? Why don't you talk about, why don't you talk about the atrocities of Iran? Why you're downplaying them? You're downplaying the crimes of the Chinese government. And again, what his response is okay, the criticism that you've made, think about how it would sound if we applied it in other contexts to other countries. So if a Russian dissident author wrote a book or was a speaker criticizing the crimes of the Russian government, would it and the Russian and apologists for the Russian government said, well, why are you talking so much about Russia? Like this, it wouldn't be mysterious. They go, because that's my country. What are you talking about? Why are you talking so much about Russia? Like, why? Oh, why'd you write a book just about the crimes in Russia? But in the United States, for some reason, it's considered, anti-American to focus on your own country, even though, like, if an Iranian did this, if a Chinese dissident did this, Chomsky pointed out Soviet dissidents never talked about American crimes. They talked about Soviet crimes. And so it makes total sense that you would focus on America. There's this other idea that there is, like, some implied excuse for the behavior of other authoritarians. Now, Chomsky is actually an anarchist. So as an anarchist, he's critical of, and he talks about state power, right? He's and concentrated power. So he is just as scathing, actually, about Vladimir Putin as he is about the United States government. Now, it doesn't come out very much because he's more interested in talking about the United States government. But he thinks that Vladimir Putin is a monster and a dictator, and that the invasion of Ukraine is totally unjustified. And weirdly, everyone accused him of, like, justifying the invasion of Ukraine. And no matter how many times he went, no, I'm not justifying it. I'm saying that U.S. policy, that the U.S. expansion of NATO made the invasion of Ukraine more likely. That doesn't mitigate or justify it. What it means is that if we look at our role in the situation, if we had behaved differently, this would have been less likely to occur. But people see that as, and they see it wrongly as, saying that it was, like, okay for Putin to invade Ukraine. And there are even these, there's, like, a group of 4 Ukrainian economists who wrote this letter, this open letter to Chomsky, where they were like, how can you justify what's happening to our country? And Chomsky wrote a reply, which was published on Counterpunch. You can read the PDF, where he just went through their email and, like, just eviscerated. He's like, none of this is implied by what I said. None of this is implied by what I said. None of this is implied by what I said. And he just demolishes it because it's not true. It's not implied by what he said that it's okay for other governments to commit atrocities.
I must say, like, on that, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when you watch, like, Chomsky clips, of him talking about something in the 70s or the 80s or the 2000s, right? Because we have, the gift of it being in the past, that you can sort of say, oh, those were the good guys and those were the bad guys. What was interesting about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is, like, all of those same kind of tropes started coming out almost in the exact same way, where you were getting, like, attacked for saying something, again, that's very reasonable, in my opinion, very honest. With all of these kinds of, like, head in the sand thing, well, if you speak out against the U.S., then you support, Putin, and you support this war and all this kind of thing. And it made me, it's both a good thing that Chomsky is still continuing to be consistent in this moment, right? And it's also extremely depressing to just realize, like, tragedy after tragedy, the same kind of dynamic plays out.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. So he's been writing since Vietnam, and it's like, okay, unjust war, the enemy is elevated into this monster who's bent on destroy, and if we don't stop them there, Chomsky was writing in the 60s about people saying, like, if we don't stop Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, he's going to show up in San Francisco next, right? And it was ludicrous, this idea that, if you don't stop them, we're going to fight them there, or we'll have to fight them here. And these same justifications, which is, we don't do things intentionally, we only do things out of benevolent mistakes, like we're trying to help, but we make these terrible blunders and errors. And so he's demolishing all of these in the case of Vietnam, putting all the facts together. Then he does the same thing, in the case of intervention in Central America in the 80s, right? He's excoriating the Reagan administration, which is saying that Nicaragua poses, like, an existential threat to the United States, and invoking national security justifications, and we got to fight the terrorists. Chomsky pointed out when the war on terror was declared by the Bush administration that it was the second time, because Reagan said he was fighting the war on terror when he was when he declared war in Central America, right? He would say, this is the global war on terror, right? So he says the same rhetoric over and over and over and over and over again. And then Iraq comes, the same kinds of things. And so every single war has these similar dynamics where you smear all the critics as unpatriotic, and the only criticisms that are permissible are criticisms that are tactical criticisms, which is you're not waging the war well enough. Right? Those criticisms appear in mainstream media, and as Chomsky points out, give the appearance of a real debate on the war.
Could you talk a little bit about Chomsky's anarchism? I know you mentioned it before, but it is a very interesting aspect of Chomsky's, one of the most well-known scholars in the world, certainly in the U.S., and certainly probably the most famous anarchist, right? Certainly in the contemporary time. And yet, I find that to be like a part of his work that I think there's a lot of confusion about, because it seems like it's a very particular tradition to Chomsky. But tell me, tell me your thoughts on that.
I think a lot of anarchists claim that Chomsky's not really an anarchist because he's not, he's okay.
Is it just because he's like old school? I mean, literally, he's old enough.
It's because he's like a very pragmatic anarchist, right? So he's not radically anti-state in the sense that he doesn't believe that you shouldn't vote or anything like that. He believes that the government has to do things. He's very, very pragmatic about it. He sees anarchism, as I understand it, as a kind of principle or a suspicion of power. And I think where that kind of leads him to is actually the very thing that people think he doesn't have, which is a serious criticism of a lot of supposedly left-wing states. His analysis of the Cold War is really interesting because essentially he says the Soviet Union wasn't socialist, the United States wasn't capitalist. This is almost entirely an illusion. These are two big, powerful states, both with centralized, concentrated power, and both with a different national myth of what they are pretending to be. So the United States pretends to be this great free market country, but actually, that we're ruled by there's not a free market. There's a very, very small, concentrated ownership. And the Soviet Union pretends to be an egalitarian socialist society, but is nothing of the kind. And so the entire construct of the Cold War as a war between capitalism and communism or capitalism and socialism, Chomsky rejects because he sees supposedly socialist states as violating his principles often just as much or if not more so than supposedly capitalist states. And so he's very critical of Marxist-Leninism, for instance. And he says that Leninism is almost identical to liberalism, because both Leninists and the liberals believe in a small caste of intellectuals who are the vanguard and make the decisions, and the job of everyone else is just to listen and go along. So his kind of anarchism leads him to interesting places intellectually that are not where some others who consider themselves on the left would go.
I don't know if there's anything else you want to get to, David, but I also have this clip of him talking about Israel-Palestine. And like I said earlier, if people are looking for a book, I mean, The Fateful Triangle, it's long, as Nathan said, but it's Chomsky's method to a T, just like relentless barrage of sort of facts and polemic in a good mix. But here's Chomsky talking about one democratic state with regards to Israel. And this is in Worcester, Mass., I believe, in 2000.
The statement is that, in the course of time, Israel should no longer exist. Well, actually, I happen to agree with that, too. In fact, so do a lot of people in Israel, the ones who think there should be a single democratic state. That's not calling for wiping anyone out. Actually, there are two countries that are not only calling for some nation not to exist, but are destroying it, namely the U.S. and Israel. That's their position with regard to the Palestinians. And they're not just saying it. I stress, they're not just saying it, they're doing it day by day. That's the meaning of the policies that are going on right before our eyes in Gaza and the West Bank, which we are supporting and paying for.
And, I can't help but, I hear in his diminished state, he's still monitoring what's going on in Israel, Palestine. And it's a depressing image. But I do think like the moment we're experiencing now where people have maybe a better ability to elaborate what's going on there owes a lot to his work over the past decades.
Well, an interesting thing that I found also in, assembling all the material that he'd ever done on Israel-Palestine in order to get the raw material for this book was that it's not that he predicted October 7th, but he certainly would not have been at all surprised by October 7th, because one of the themes that comes out in his speeches on Israel-Palestine is he says over and over, he says... Israel could have had security, but it chose expansion. And he says that, he dates it to about, I think, 1971, he says, where he thinks was a crucial missed opportunity. There was a deal on the table with Egypt that Israel rejected. And he says essentially, like, the Israel-Palestine conflict could have been resolved, but Israel made a choice, and that choice is going to perhaps be disastrous, in fact, probably be disastrous for Israel itself in the long run. And he says the people who say they believe in Israel's security don't believe in Israel's security. In fact, they are condemning it to endless warfare. And because the situation that hardline Israelis, far-right Israelis, want is to essentially control the Palestinian territory without giving the Palestinians autonomy indefinitely. Well, okay, but that's going to spark resistance. That's inevitable. You just can't hold a population subjugated forever. So there's going to be endless war. There just is going to be. And so this was one of the things that he hammered over and over again was, even as the Trump administration and then the Biden administration were celebrating, the quiet in the Middle East. And I think Jake Sullivan had written this now embarrassing-looking thing in Foreign Policy or Foreign Affairs, where he's like, the Middle East, it's so quiet. Look how much we succeeded. Chomsky would have said, well, this is an illusion because Israel is not secure, because Israel is oppressing a population, and you are going to have a backlash. You are just going to have one sooner or later. And so if you look back over his speeches on this, I think he's very, very prescient.
We'll in the last couple of minutes before we change topics, I wanted to ask you this as somebody who's been working on this project with him, somebody who's been very influenced by Chomsky. Some of our, we have like younger audience members who might not have really had much experience with Chomsky a few years later. If a young person who reaches out to you and says, hey, this Chomsky guy seems really interesting. Where should I start? What should I be learning from him? What should I be looking for? How would you respond to that?
Well, obviously the book is my response to that, because I know there are those people. And the fact that I didn't have a good response to those people is why I asked him if I could work with him on a book that would compile. It's not a best of, because it's not previously published writings. It's a new, updated, freshly original book, but it's something that, like, there's the introductory chapter, which is about how the U.S. crafts its mythology of itself and the contrast between the image and the reality. Then it goes through a series of conflicts. It goes through the Global South. It goes through Vietnam. It goes through Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, China, Russia. Then there's a chapter on the media. There's a chapter on international law. There's a chapter on the domestic power structure. And then there's a conclusion encouraging people to fight. So that's the kind of structure of it, because I wanted to take people through in that way. Now, other than, pre-order the book, I would say that we'll start watching his lectures on YouTube. If you look up Chomsky videos on YouTube, I did a cool interview with him. Probably the second interview I did with him was much better than the first. The first I was very nervous and it wasn't very good. The second interview, I figured out what I wanted to ask him, and that's pretty good. But lots of people did interviews with him. I would also say that he's best when he's being challenged. So if Chomsky was being asked like flattering questions by sympathetic audiences, he would just kind of give his canned answers a lot. But when he gets critical questioners, so there's an interview with Andrew Marr on, I think, the BBC. There's like a Canadian conservative who, there's one where David Frum confronts Chomsky, like in the 80s. David Frum's like 25, and he's like, "You don't care about the Kurds." And Chomsky's like, "I have been helping the Kurds for years." It's great. And if you watch like the William F. Buckley debate, like you see, or Alan Dershowitz, or he debated Richard Pearl, one of the leading neocons. So if you watch Chomsky in these debates where the claws really come out, he gets very, very lively, and also by being challenged, you see his responses to the anticipated criticisms. And that's really helpful because you can see that the things that people say to support the other side of the argument, he can deal with those things and respond to those things and show why those things are wrong. So I would recommend watching Chomsky engaging with hostile audience questions and hostile debate opponents.
Well, there you all go. Got your marching orders there. Nathan, I mean, I think we'll just have to get you back on sometime soon to talk about Joe Biden and all of that. But really, it's been really wonderful speaking with you and talking about Chomsky. I mean, somebody who has made a huge impact on so many of us on the world, and whose work deserves to be celebrated, read, and distributed as much as possible.
I also have an essay that I wrote back in 2018 called "Lessons from Chomsky," where I just compiled, I think, 12 things that I felt like I had learned from reading his work over the years, with some quotes from him. So people might want to check that out.
Well, before we let you go, talking about checking things out, Current Affairs, excellent magazine. Anything, where can people, get more access to that? Anything exciting coming down the pipeline soon?
Well, currentaffairs.org they should go to, and they can follow us on Twitter at CUR Affairs. Let's see. I mean, the book is the main thing that has been the main project for us recently, but we are continuing to put out wonderful issues of our magazine. We have, and we also have a podcast. So the print edition is our baby. So subscribe to the print edition.
Also subscribe if you got like a sort of pretentious baby uncle or something. Current Affairs is the perfectly named magazine to subscribe them to, and they might not realize what
that's
they're
important.
reading.
Subscribe your enemies to Current Affairs, because you don't just have to subscribe yourself. Subscribe people you dislike to the magazine so that they get it against their will. That's really important. I also wrote a book called Why You Should Be a Socialist, and the purpose of that book is to annoy relatives. It's just a gift book for right-wing relatives, so Why You Should Be a Socialist. Highly recommend that if you want to antagonize someone.
Well, there we go. Nathan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to see you, David. Nice to see you, Matt. All the best.
Nice to see you, Nathan. Thank you.
Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, and I'm very honored and thrilled to be joined by a return guest on Left Reckoning, Moureen Kaki, who is a filmmaker, activist, and a Palestinian-American. Moureen, why don't just get us started? Why don't you tell us where you are at?
Yeah, hi, David. Thanks so much for having me back. It's good to talk with you again. I am currently in Gaza in Palestine. I have been here for a week to date, actually. This is my second trip back to Gaza since, it's my second trip back to Gaza, period. But just notably in the context of the current genocide, I was back here in March for 2 weeks. And I'm back with the same organization called GLIA International, which is a Canadian-based organization that brings in emergency medical teams to the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I mean, we're very happy that we're able to have this conversation. And I was thinking maybe, to get us started. I mean, you've been watching this from like the United States, and now you're there on the ground. Could you just share a little bit of your experience of what you've been seeing and what people in the U.S. should, maybe be noting that they might not have, not be able to fully recognize or appreciate from this far away?
Yeah. So I'm not sure where to start, honestly. I guess I'll start sort of in chronological order. It was, so just so folks know, when I came back in March, I came when the Rafah border was still open. So I came through Egypt. Of course, as most of your listeners are probably aware, the Rafah border has been closed since May 6th, since the Israeli military occupied the Rafah border and subsequently invaded Rafah, the last remaining safe space in the Gaza Strip. And so this time around, my entry was a little bit different. It was much more difficult. I was waiting in Cairo for 2 weeks and then in Amman, Jordan, for another week until I was let in, along with another delegate in the same delegation. Our entry this time was, rather than the Rafah border and going through Egyptian security and then subsequently Palestinian security, we went through the Jordanian bridge called Medik Hussein Bridge, which is how Palestinians who live in the West Bank and people visiting the West Bank directly go into Palestine. And so we went through there and then went through Israeli security, and we were escorted to the what is known as the Kerem Abu Salim crossing, or the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is typically a cargo crossing. It's not where people in recent history cross into the Gaza Strip. And driving through Gaza the second time around was pretty devastating. I'm not exactly sure of the route that we took, but I know that we passed around Khan Yunis, and it was, I mean, for lack of a better term, it was an absolute like wasteland. There was like no standing building in sight. I mean, we drove through a portion of the city that literally was just piles of dirt and rubble, in exactly the way you'd imagine it. I mean, I couldn't see a single structure that was standing, not a house, not a store, not anything. Nothing was recognizable. The streets weren't streets. And then when we did get to parts of the streets, you could just see where they had bombed on the street directly. And this is the main street, which was once like the main street to go north and south into Gaza. It's called Salah ad-Din Street. And the whole scene was just remarkably devastating. I was in Rafah in March, and I mean, the situation was horrible. Of course, there were 1.7 million people in a portion of the Gaza Strip that under prior to October 7th had a population of about 280,000. And so there was clearly no infrastructure to support that many people, but people were still like carrying on, you know. There were tents in the streets. There were new refugee camps that had popped up, but there were some like functioning clinics. People would sort of barter and build like markets along the streets. And now all of that is just completely gone. And even though, like, I was here in March and I thought to myself, like, this is really horrible. I don't know how it could get any worse. I'm back almost exactly 3 months later, and things have gotten unfathomably worse. So we got here on Thursday, and our first day in Nusayrat camp was we were getting our orientation in the hospital that we were supposed to be at in the Nusayrat camp, and in the middle of our orientation is when the massacre started. The thing that Secretary Blinken and Joe Biden ended up calling the rescue operation, but it was eventually like essentially we knew that it was a bloody massacre that killed 274 Palestinians, and that doesn't include the people who have already or are going to die from the severity of the injuries that they received in this operation. And so we were in the thick of it at that time, and it was just kind of bizarre because we're an hour into the orientation with the hospital director, and we hear like bombs and just explosions going on in the background. And of course, it's relatively typical. We're in, you know, a conflict zone or whatever. And so we, you know, this is things that we heard even in our time in Rafah, but it wasn't like this, not in proximity to us, not in frequency, and not in severity. And the medical staff and hospital staff that I was with at the time who are much more attuned to the sounds, of course, than I am, were able to distinguish sort of Apache helicopter sounds from quadcopter sounds from explosions. And it was, we started to realize there was something when the frequency just wouldn't let up, and in fact started to increase. And sure enough, the casualties started just pouring into the hospital. And at one point I had gone down to the sort of what is the emergency room. This is actually, under normal circumstances, this hospital that we were at is a maternity hospital. There was an international NGO who had come and worked with the hospital to set up a tent clinic outside in the front. And that's where, you know, it was kind of a makeshift emergency room. I say that, but please, like, for all your listeners, take that with a huge grain of salt. This is also in the context of the fact that no medical supplies have been let into Gaza since the closure of the Rafah border on May 6th. And even before that, what was being let in was just minuscule in terms of what is needed, right? And so you have hospital staff, healthcare workers, who are trying to manage injuries like, you know, loss of limb, just severe. I mean, the types of injuries that you can imagine that would come with severe explosions, and bombing, and just relentless gunfire. The Israeli military had bombed a market nearby. They had bombed residential buildings, and so the injuries that were coming in, I mean, it was just the downstairs scene was just unfathomable. I mean, it was just injury after injury after injury after casualty after casualty after casualty, in something unlike anything I've ever seen before. Yeah, I don't. I'm still processing the things that I saw and the things that I heard, and I'm not sure I'll ever be able to, like, make sense of what I saw.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I can't imagine, you know, the feeling and the emotion, and then the brutal reality that because of, you know, Joe Biden's weakness, and Israeli cruelty, that these aren't fully staffed, and supplied operations, to care for this just I mean, you know, if something like this were to happen, you know, here in Austin, it would be a difficult situation to be in a hospital, but that's a hospital that has, like, the medical equipment and staff that it needs. I mean, could you talk a little bit more, I mean, about, like, you know, the difficulty of getting supplies, into Gaza, you know, I think it really needs to be highlighted for folks. I mean, first of all, I mean, you know, on the kind of pressing issue, you know, I've been seeing very worrying reports about the food situation in Gaza. And could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So just to reemphasize in terms of supplies in general, and then I'll hone in on the food question, if that's okay. Again, the Rafah border has been closed since May 6th. This stuff about airdrops, which I think a few airdrops happened today in terms of aid, and all that, is just kind of, it's so meaningless. It's all just kind of, it really is just sort of a political stunt. The fact that the Rafah border is closed has meant basically an incapacitation of medical supplies, of food supplies. And it really is detrimental. I mean, it's detrimental on top of an already catastrophic situation, right? So there is small amounts of food being let in, but I don't think people, maybe if you've just tuned into this since October, into Gaza, I mean, since October, maybe people are not aware about how much Gaza had previously already, without the context of the genocide, but just the siege, was already reliant on outside aid, right? Yeah, so you're talking about a population that's 70% unemployed, and this is again pre-genocide, 70% unemployed because of the siege, because of the occupation, and so it was already reliant extremely heavily on aid. Now add on top of that the context of genocide, which means materially, which means that nearly everybody in Gaza is homeless, right? They've been made homeless. There is no means to access food supplies. There's no means to access basic necessities such as water, right, without relying on aid. And then even when the Rafah border was open, it still wasn't enough. And so now with the closure of the Rafah border, you can imagine how much more that's already exacerbated, again, an already catastrophic situation. And so hospitals are functioning on beyond the absolute bare minimum, right? They don't have basic supplies. One of our midwives, who's on the same delegation as I am, doesn't have umbilical cord clamps, right? Something so minor in terms of giving birth, which should be a normal practice. Gauze is in a massive shortage. Infection control is nearly impossible because there's just not enough supplies to be able to manage that. And then the food situation, like you've alluded to, is just awful. You have over 3,000 Palestinian children in Gaza who are facing imminent death because of malnutrition, right? And one of the consequences that I think people don't talk about enough is that even if somehow a switch flipped for the better tomorrow, all of these things were fixed, right? That we could bring in an unlimited food supply. This kind of malnutrition that people are facing here in Gaza will have lifelong consequences, no matter what. Assuming that these people are even able to survive the levels of malnutrition that we're seeing here, it will affect their lives forever. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know what words there are to describe this anymore. I keep using words like devastating and catastrophic and horrifying, and it still doesn't quite convey the reality of the situation, I think.
No, I mean, it's obviously like the goal must be to stop the violence as soon as possible. But I mean, it's hard to imagine what the next few years are going to be like, even in that case. And like, I mean, I was hoping to ask your kind of I mean, I imagine it's tough here, but like what is like the kind of spirit like on the ground? I mean, when you're talking to people, emotionally, personally, like how are folks sort of reacting to this? Because I mean, it's getting frustrating in the States because it's starting to get to the point where we're starting to have abstract conversations again, if that makes sense, instead of like material conversations of this ongoing experience. So I was just wondering if you could sort of highlight that for us.
Yeah, I really actually appreciate you and appreciate that point. People tend to use the word resilient a lot when it comes to Palestinians. The sort of Arabic equivalent is Samdin, right? They're steadfast and resilient on their land. I can't help but really not to like crush anybody's spirits, but the reality is that people are resilient because they have to be, not because they've been given a choice and because they choose that, right? People are exhausted. People are suffering. Everybody that you talk to has lost someone. Doctors, just to give you an example, one of the doctors during the massacre knew that his family he had already been displaced more than once. And he knew that his family was in an apartment that they were able to rent. They were one of the lucky few who were able to rent an apartment. And this is the point we got to, right, where I'm talking about somebody who's being displaced and working for free is one of the lucky few. But he knew while the massacre was happening that his family was in an apartment that in an area where the operation, the massacre was being held. And I didn't know this about him until after it ended, but seeing him work, you wouldn't have guessed. Like, he was just carrying through because he had a job to do and because people have gotten that used to death and destruction, but it doesn't hurt any less, right? Like, if people, by the end of it, I mean, everybody you talk to is so beyond exhausted, and they're carrying on literally because they have no other choice. And that's really it. There's just nothing else to do but try to survive the next day, right? And yeah, I mean, I don't know what else I can say about that. It really is like easy to sort of abstract resilience and abstract this steadfastness, but seeing the material conditions that people are living in, right? the fact that there's a brutal heat and people don't have access to electricity is another layer on top of the lack of food, on top of the lack of medical supplies, on top of the lack of homes, on top of the lack of just basic infrastructure, right? No running water, no electricity, no anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's truly brutal, and it's why having some of these kind of, I'm not going to have you get into this stuff, but like there's a thing this week with AOC doing a conversation about like the left's anti-Semitism problem. It's just sort of wild to be having these conversations at this point. But I wanted to ask you on this too, not to be too U.S. focused, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, these significant protests that we've been seeing across the U.S. are being sort of perceived in Gaza, because, one of the attacks from the right has been that like, oh, these movements, that are sort of trying to get universities to, disinvest from Israel's apartheid system, or trying to put pressure on Democratic Party politicians, aren't like real or significant, or, they're just sort of like for young people to like have like something to get excited about, worked up about, instead of something that is actively, trying to help and aid folks in Gaza. I'm just curious if you have any, perspective on that, how these things are sort of being seen or perceived, if seen at all. I mean, I reckon that, there's a kind of immediate focus on life and surviving. But just if you could convey, how if the meaning of these things.
Yeah, I think for the few people that I have talked to about this, both this time around and the previous, of course, when I was here in March, it wasn't the student protests that were happening, but I did ask people's read on sort of what they thought of marches and things like that they were happening in the U.S. And of course they were appreciative. It was an echo of solidarity and a source of like hope that somebody in the world actually gave a shit about them. Mm-hmm. And I think that the calls, more importantly, of those protests were in the right place, right? Like people front and center. The student movement had it right. Most of the protests that I've seen in the U.S. had it right in terms of the immediate call and immediate ask is for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And then talking about things like lifting the siege and putting efforts towards, well, this is what I've seen less, which I think the U.S. could focus on, which is talking about also in material ways, like what does it mean to lift the siege, right? Mm-hmm. What is the rebuilding of Gaza going to look like, right? We're talking about estimates taking 80 years to clear the amount of rubble and rebuild the infrastructure that previously existed, and that's assuming that the genocide stopped today, which unfortunately, there's no indication that it will. And so, for I guess my short answer is that people interpret it as a sign of hope that somebody's listening. And I think people's hearts and their asks are in the right place. But I do think that there's more really within the left. There's more conversations about the material consequences of these things to be had, rather than sort of abstracting what it means to have like a free Palestine, right? Which I think we're a far cry away from at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, in the last couple of minutes, I mean, I wanted to just sort of hear your sense and opinions on, how that ceasefire conversation is going. I mean, we have Joe Biden, who's sort of, been going around saying that, like, there's a deal on the table and that Hamas is basically preventing the ceasefire from happening. I mean, I was just curious of your reaction to that.
I don't know, David. I'm so hesitant to like even talk about my reaction to this, because it's just such, quite frankly, bullshit, right? Like if the U.S. wanted a ceasefire, if the U.S. actually gave a shit, they would stop arming Israel, right? Mm-hmm. We've seen massacre after massacre. We've seen the targeting of hospitals. We've seen, the New York Times itself put out an article talking about the sexual abuse and the horrible ways they've gone about it of Palestinian boys and men. And these are American sources of information, right? It's not like it's that. And so I think if the U.S. actually gave a shit about a ceasefire, that they would have supported calls for. And when I mean they, I'm talking about the government. They would have supported calls for an immediate and permanent ceasefire a long time ago, and they would have stopped their material support for the Israeli military and the Israeli government, who are committed to this genocide. And I think it would have been really easy, right, to do that, right? Stop sending the bombs that that are dropping on the places where they're like, oops, sorry, we didn't know there were civilians there. It's like, yeah, you did. And not only can you not say that, but these are your bombs and your tax dollars. So now, it's just kind of, I'm sure there's some sort of expression to describe, like some sort of clever expression to describe the U.S.'s role in this, but it's just so irrelevant, and it really just sort of boils my blood to even try to engage in conversations about what Blinken or Biden have to say about this when they've just been unconditionally supportive of this and continue to be, right, regardless of what Hamas may have said or done in relation to ceasefire, the most recent ceasefire talks, I should say.
So no, I mean, and I feel you 100% on all of that. I think the last couple of things I wanted to ask you about is just, I mean, obviously getting in and out right now is extremely difficult. Could you just, I'm curious, like, the ability of, like, for example, like journalists to be able to get in, is that the possibility right now? So, and I know you talked about it a little bit, but like, getting aid workers and aid in is becoming, almost virtually, impossible, or at least incredibly arduous. Could you talk about, short of the things that we would like to see, immediate ceasefire and things like that, what could be sort of done to sort of like alleviate and allow for folks to be getting into Gaza to be able to do the work that's so desperately needed right now?
Yeah, I think it's as simple as opening the Rafah crossing. There is an existing crossing in which it is the most effective way to get aid in and out of, or aid into the Gaza Strip. And one of the things that I think people don't talk about enough in terms of the consequences of the Rafah crossing is not just that humanitarian and aid missions can't get in, but it's that people can't get out, right? You're talking about people dying, otherwise preventable deaths who, if the Rafah border were open, would be able to have the possibility of getting evacuated and seeking medical care elsewhere. And now countless people have died since May 6th and the closure of the Rafah border because Israel refuses to let them out. Right? It's really that simple. So it's become extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. We are not even, as our delegates, we are not even allowed to bring supplies in, right, with us. That is just a complete ban. The only medical supplies and equipment that we are allowed to bring is for personal use. So if I want to bring Tylenol because I might anticipate that I have a headache or allergy medication or whatever, but not an ounce of medical supplies is being let in, even as medical aid workers are being let in, right? And the United Nations is allowing the oppressor, Israel in this case, to control this, right? To control these negotiations in this way. And there's no other choice. So aside from the consequences of hospitals and people functioning with little to no supplies, people are also dying because they can't leave because the Rafah border is closed.
Well, I was just, it's frustrating because really at a certain point, it's actually very simple. When we talk about what needs to happen, could you just let people know the best way that they can help out and support, the work that you're doing and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, as and some people will probably roll their eyes at me, but I really think it's still not too late to call your congressperson to emphasize the opening of the Rafah border. I think now more than anything, demanding and sort of putting forward that conversation about the Rafah border and reopening that is a huge deal. Because I think, of course, an immediate and permanent ceasefire is needed. But one of the quickest ways that a mass amount of pain and suffering can be alleviated is by the opening of that Rafah border. So advocating for that in any way that you see fit, including that and forwarding it in your conversations, whether that's with Congress people, whether that's with local officials, whether that's with fellow organizers, but forefronting that along with the immediate and permanent ceasefire, I think is one of the most important ways that people can support.
Well, I'll make sure to let everybody know to be doing that. I think it's important to actually have those kind of material demands and put pressure on folks. Moureen, I really appreciate speaking with you. Appreciate you taking the time. Appreciate the work that you're doing so much.
Thank you so much, David, for having me. It's good to talk to you as always.
And thank you to David for doing that interview there with Maureen. And I think that I appreciate her with that advice. And I know people roll their eyes and that they shouldn't, frankly.
Mhm.
That actually is something that there's a book, Who Killed Bertha Caceres? And there was action motivated by folks who got on the phone lines to Congress people on that front. Like these sorts of things. It's actually one thing from the resistance when Trump was in office era that I think probably shouldn't have been lost. Actually, was the blowing up the phones and basically the communications of these Congress people when they are, administering a genocide.
I mean, and again, too, especially when the demand to open up the Rafah crossing is so simple and just desperately, desperately needed.
Absolutely.
All right, folks. Well, we're going to go over to the post game, patreon.com/left reckoning to get access to that. Hope you all enjoyed the show. It's really great having both Nathan and Maureen on the program. Matt and I are going to be hanging out a little bit, having some fun, taking some
You got a
questions from.
full course for us, isn't that right? In the are you doing the
We're going to have to
the
hold
big
that one
thing?
for a little bit. It's
Okay,
too much of a meal. We're going to
gotcha.
do a
Okay,
big
fair enough.
Bitcoin in Texas episode soon, but we're going to do a segment,
Right.
but it's too big. But we
Well,
got
in that case, we got some fun stuff with AI. Actually, I don't know if you memes coming to life, David. Or that thing where AI guys are like, this shit that I'm showing you. I know it looks like 100% ass. I know it looks like ass, right? But exponential growth, computer chips only getting faster and faster. In like 5 months, this stuff is going to start being life changing. Well, folks, it's here because memes are coming to life.
those things that you all love. Yeah. These guys don't really
We're the
understand.
only way.
What's awesome about these, and we'll get into this, but like what's awesome about
Yeah.
these guys is like they actually start to like, I don't know, organize their like life around memes, right? And yet they don't understand them.
It's
Like
their
what
entire
makes them
emotional
funny.
lexicon.
They just know other people sort of like identify with these things and they hold on to. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to
Yeah.
be talking about artificial intelligence, taking y'all's calls, questions, all that good stuff. Over at the post game, you can get access to that patreon.com/left reckoning. There's a QR code to get that as well. And don't forget, if you want to support the show too, you can also get hats, t-shirts, and sweaters over at leftreckoning.com/store. If you want to keep the show going, it really helps us keep moving. So thanks, friends. Appreciate all of y'all so much. And come over, hang out with us in the post game.
All right, folks, we will see you there once I figure out how to bring up videos in this new series. Here we go.